ráno nebo dobré dopoledne. Děkujeme moc, že jste se k nám přidali na dnešní program Školy Propagandy, který je nedílnou součástí instalace Jonase Staala, která se jmenuje Stanice Propagandy a v které se právě nacházíte. A já tady vítám Jonase, nizozemského autora, umělce a výzkumníka a aktivisty, který přijal naše pozvání a stal se letošním zahraničním hostem Ceny Jindřicha Chalupeckého. A právě touhle rozsáhlou instalací a také právě tím, co tady teď my společně zažijeme nebo provádíme, se zabývá tématem propagandy ze všech možných úhlů pohledu. Vy už jste měli možnost trošičku nahlédnout do samotné instalace. Nacházíme se v takovém obráceném panoptikonu, v takovém modelu, kdy vevnitř není ten dozorce, ale naopak my jsme vlastně ti uprostřed toho kruhu a kolem nás v těch pomyslných, dejme tomu, celách jsou právě ty různé aspekty propagandy, ať už klimatická propaganda nebo finanční propaganda, nebo třeba i geologický pohled na propagandu a spousta dalších rovin. A důležitým bodem toho dnešního setkání, a po něm ještě budou během výstavy následovat další části Školy Propagandy, je do celé diskuze s Jonasem, s jeho instalací, také s novým filmem, který vznikl právě pro tuhle příležitost a běží tady za námi, tak uvést opravdu ten dialog v místních kontextech. Přizvali jsme místní teoretiky, aktivisty, aby se během celé výstavy na tom programu podíleli. A dnes tady srdečně vítáme Andreu Průchovou-Hrůzovou a Jana Bělíčka, kteří po Jonasově úvodu budou následovat svými přednáškami o roli médií, ale také třeba obrazu uprchlictví, a budeme moc rádi, když se zapojíte do diskuzí o těch tématech. Bohužel z důvodu nemoci dnes nemůže vystoupit Eliška Koldová odpoledne, takže její program budeme muset přesunout na jiný termín, ale za to nám tím pádem po obědě vyzbyde víc času na společnou diskuzi. A já jenom ještě řeknu pár praktických informací. Program bude probíhat primárně v českém jazyce, přednášky jsou připravené v češtině, pro zahraniční publikum bude následně k dispozici dokumentace, která bude otitulkovaná, ale myslím si, že dnes je nás tady většina česky mluvících, nicméně Jonas bude svůj úvod říkat v angličtině, já to po něm zkusím úplně kratičce shrnout, a ta odpolední diskuze, protože její součástí bude také kurátorka a naše hostka z Makedonie Ivana Vaševa, kam právě tahleta instalace poputuje v rámci naší mezinárodní platformy Islands of Kinship, takže ta odpolední diskuze se bude odehrávat v angličtině. Pokud budete potřebovat asistenci, překlad otázky nebo nějaké odpovědi, budeme tady s kolegyněmi pro vás. A možná se jenom tak rámcově zeptám, jestli ti, co tady jste, jak jste na tom s angličtinou a jak moc mám překládat Jonasův úvod, jestli můžeme hlavně anglicky tu část, anebo budete... Stojí někdo o překlad? Dobře, super. Tak tím pádem já ho nechám, no need for translation of your introduction, so that's good news. A kdyby náhodou to bylo potřeba, tak zase jsme tady s kolegyněmi a můžeme si k někomu sednout a třeba vám tak jenom překládat rámcově. A ten úvod bude relativně krátký, potom naváže rovnou Andrea, potom budeme mít pauzu a bude následovat přednáška Honzy Bělíčka. A ještě prostorově samozřejmě můžeme si sednout jakkoliv tady v tom místě, je to místo kruhové, nemá být hierarchické, můžete si vzít polštáře, sednout si kamkoliv na židle, na zem, případně jsou ještě židle k dispozici venku, a kdybyste si u toho chtěli ještě poležet nebo se nějakým způsobem odpočinout od toho přímého kontaktu, tak protože je nás hodně, tak je program zároveň streamován v kině Plata, které je jenom tady diagonálně vedle nás, takže je možné i tam ten program sledovat a zároveň je velmi důležitá věc, že v kině se také odehrává workshop se Storytellers, jedněmi z laureátek letošní ceny Jindřicha Chalupeckého a je to workshop vyšívání kytičky privilegií, kde si můžete tak trošku prozkoumat svoje zázemí, privilegia, neprivilegia a zároveň dělat něco rukodělného, takže pokud preferujete poslouchat přednášky a vyšívat u toho, tak je možnost i toho kina. Takže děkujeme moc, že jste přišli a já už předám slovo Jonasovi. Thank you so much for being here with us. I will not translate all of this, but you know all of it already, so please start with the introduction and we will follow up with Andrea.
Super. Do I need to use a microphone or can I just...
Yes,
I already have one.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Propaganda Station. Welcome to the Propaganda School. I'm just checking if I talk like this, can you also hear me sitting there? It's okay? Kind of? Okay. Half. If I up the volume, is it better like this? Okay, that fits the Propaganda School. No, like the first speaker is going like, hello, going Hugo Chavez on you. Okay. So first of all, thank you, Karina, for the invitation, and thank you to everyone who has been contributing, Susanna and Ondrej and Veronica and Lamia and Jakub, everyone who worked and contributed to making this school a possibility. And a very special thanks to Andrea and to Jan, the two key faculty members of the Propaganda School that you will hear from today. I learned a lot from our previous conversations. It influenced also my own research and my own writing. So unfortunately, I won't be able to hear exactly what you're going to say today. But I feel that I've been pre-educated a lot on your research, so thanks a lot for that. So I think Karina already mentioned a few things about the space where we are in. Very shortly, the idea of this propaganda station that will be traveling from Ostrava to Skopje to Zagreb and other locations, and Bratislava and other locations. Its key idea is that it's modeled after the panopticon, famous prison model developed by Jeremy Bentham. The idea was we have the guard of the prison that stands at the center of the prison model, and the cells are all around. So you need very little police force, you could say, security surveillance force, to oversee at once a lot of the prisoners, of the subjects. What I try to do with this installation is to imprison in each of the cells a propaganda that was part of my research from the last 10 years. So from ultranationalist propaganda to alt-right propaganda, from climate propaganda to geological propaganda, research in the way that propaganda operates in all of these different contexts. But different than our usual experience of propaganda, we are the subjects, the receivers of propaganda. The propagandist oversees us. We don't see the propagandist. I tried to create a space in which we could do it the other way around. We sit here in the center of the school, well, most of us, some of us, half of us, and we are able to oversee these different propagandas in each of their cells. It was an attempt to reverse this division of power, this distribution of power. And here in the center is a short film, Propaganda Theater. Maybe you have a chance to see it later or get some impressions from it now, which is a new film. And that is, in a way, the introduction to all the propagandas around. So if you're like, I'm not going to be standing in front of these screens all around us, then you can also just take 15 minutes and you kind of get the core of it. So a few notes that I want to share from my own research in propaganda before we start with the key faculty that will be talking today. I did a PhD on the subject of propaganda art from the 20th to the 21st century. I wrote a book on propaganda art in the 21st century for the MIT Press. And the core argument from this research, that is also central to this installation, is that we have to break with the idea that propaganda is somehow inherent to the history of totalitarianism. Like there are certain historians, art historians, like Igor Golomstok. He wrote a book called Totalitarian Art, and they propagate, you could say, this very popular narrative that when we say propaganda, we say Nazi Germany, we say Stalinist Russia, we say North Korea, we say even Russia under Putinism today. Propaganda is inherently linked to dictatorship, to the history of dictatorship. And the argument of historians like Golomstok is that the visual production of these regimes are at the end all the same. So okay, they might have historical different histories of how they came into being, obviously between Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany, but in the end it's the same heroic peasant, heroic workers, the dictator as the father of the nation. In the end, these historians argue it's the same totalitarianism that produces all of these visual forms. In the end, they all look alike. They're all the same thing. I think this is a very dangerous argument. Propaganda is never total. I think the word totalitarianism is already a problem. Like how total does something need to be called totalitarianism? It's also dangerous to conflate very different political histories and aesthetic histories. Like for example, the visual art of Maoist China, which rejected the pedestal, which tried to work with less durable materials, which had a very theatrical use. Like the monuments were often meant to depict histories of oppression, for peasants to be paraded by the monuments, to spit on the monuments, to spit on the image of the oppressor, there was a theatrical component to it. It's very different from the role that monuments took in Soviet Russia. It's not to say one is somehow better or less bad than the other. They are different because these histories are different. The other aspect that makes it risky to conflate this propaganda with totalitarianism is that it makes us unsusceptible for the role that propaganda plays in contemporary democracies. And even the way that propaganda played a role, much more complex role in these dictatorships. For example, if we think of propaganda, we often think of Nazi Germany. Some of the most famous films, like Der Eeuwige Juden by Fritz Hippler, a film that takes the form of a documentary, like it stages a kind of objective view, equating Jewish peoples with rats and vermin on one hand as a plague and as all controlling bankers on the other. This is a strange double-faced aspect of propaganda that you will often see returning, that the enemy is both ridiculous, dirty and powerless, but also simultaneously the most powerful. It's vermin and rats that you just need to get rid of, it's a plague, but there are also the all-controlling bankers that control the contemporary Soros narrative, they control behind the scene. There's just this strange double-faced aspect to it. But these kind of films, these famous propaganda films like Der Eeuwige Jude, the Eternal Jew, they were not popular in Nazi Germany at all. So the only way that they had a public was that Nazi members were mandated to sit and look at these films in order for there to be a public at all. 90% of Goebbels' film production was popular entertainment. So there were like these entertainment blockbusters like Der große Liebe, The Great Love. It's about the story of a singer and a Nazi commander. But it's not really about the war. It's not really about Nazism. It's just Nazism is a neutral backdrop. It's the flag in the background, the war in the background. Just like today, the public of Nazi Germany was much more interested in being entertained with family quarrels and love stories, and it's much more effective to introduce these dominant narratives of the regimes when people feel that they entertain themselves voluntarily. When we feel free in what we're doing, when we are feeling free that it's a choice, I want to see, I'm much more susceptible than when something is, when the kind of doctrinal message is being imposed on me. So here, for example, in the film, you see some clips, like films you might know, like Godzilla, King of Monsters, I think, and what was the other? There's a couple that come by. There's like some Marvel movies. There's some James Bond. Here's Iron Man. What connects all of these films? They all received direct funding from the Pentagon Liaison Office. So this is the cultural wing of the Pentagon, the American military wing of the government who gives subsidies to films in which the US military is portrayed in what they consider an accurate way, meaning the way that they want to be seen in the world. If you adjust your scripts to their suggestions of accuracy, you will get free military personnel. Like when you see a soldier in Godzilla, that's an actual soldier. Like that is free sponsorship from the Pentagon. They're like real soldiers. They provide the helicopters, they provide them. If your script gets cancelled and you're not willing to make these adjustments, that's millions and millions of dollars of subsidies. You will not be able to make the entertainment blockbuster you want. That has been a very effective way of using popular entertainment to change key aspects from films that might have been too critical on the history of the US in Afghanistan and how that created the conditions for the Taliban and Al-Qaeda to emerge, and how there are historical contexts to many of the conflicts that we're dealing with today. This is not to conflate. It's not to say Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda is somehow the same as Pentagon Liaison Office. These are different regimes, but propaganda is present in both of them. I would actually argue wherever there is power, there is propaganda. And as such, as Jacques Ellul argued, it's important to speak of propagandas in the plural, and that's why I chose for this form of the propaganda station with these different cells. To say propaganda is not a singular thing. We have to look at, from the field of whether it's ultranationalism or high finance, or even geology, the way we tell about the history of the earth, the history of life, the origins of life. Propaganda plays a role in each of them, and we have to look at each of them specifically to understand. So to speak of propagandas in the plural, and the propaganda school in which we are here aims to study this plurality of propagandas. But if propaganda is not a singular thing, if it's not by definition linked to authoritarianism and to the history of dictatorship, if it also equally appears in democracy, then so what is it? Like what is it? What do we talk about when we talk about propaganda? I would say a very important contemporary modern propaganda model that applies both to dictatorships and to democracy is one developed by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman in the 80s, in the period of the Cold War, in their book Manufacturing Consent. And their propaganda model argues that propaganda is not just about sending a message. It's not about a single message. It's about the entire infrastructure of communication in a society. Propaganda doesn't want to send a message, it wants to construct a reality, a new consent, a narrative, a belief system that we collectively come to internalize and partake into. I would summarize it as propaganda is invested in infrastructure, in narrative, and in imagination. Infrastructure in the sense that you need to control the means of the production of a narrative. Like it's essential to control the media, for example, to be able to produce, to introduce, for your message to be omnipresent, to the point where you don't even see it as a message. You just see it as your normal, as your new normal. This was the point of Goebbels producing all of this blockbuster cinema. He didn't want people to think about Nazism. He just wanted Nazism to be there, you know? And every love story, every family quarrel, every story of life takes place within that regime. You don't think anymore about the regime. It's just there. It's your norm. That is manufacturing consent. That you don't even recognize something as a message. It becomes entirely the stage of your everyday life. So infrastructure is essential to produce these messages. Then narrative. That's in a way, it's the origin story that we tell. So an example of this origin story is Make America Great Again. That's a master narrative. It refers to a past greatness that never existed. It's a kind of weird retro science fiction, which is then produced as an image to return to. It's a future that never happened that we're going to return to. It's a very strange play with past and present and future if you think about it. But the fact that the history was never real doesn't mean that it cannot become reality. If we believe that the past existed, then it can be realized. If we can imagine it, then it can be realized. And that's what a master narrative aims to do, to produce an imagination, the third component of propaganda, the imagination of the type of reality that propaganda wants to produce. So infrastructure, narrative, imagination is essential to manufacture a new consent, to construct a new reality. Now I say all of this not as I'm a propaganda researcher, I'm first and foremost an artist. So I'm very interested in the role that art and visuality, morphology plays in constructing a new reality, in manufacturing a new consent. What you will see in this film and in the case studies around you is an emphasis on the role that script, narrative, the stage, infrastructure, the actor, the subject of propaganda plays in the production of new realities. Hi, Andrea. Another member of our faculty that will participate later. So instead of just speaking of theaters of war, I think it's also essential we speak of theaters of propaganda. Power needs form. Power relies on form. And that's where the role of artists and cultural workers comes in. On one hand, in what I call the dark art world. So here we are, you could say, in propaganda studies, you have a term. It's called black propaganda. It's when you don't know where a message comes from. So the origin of a message is obscure. And you have white propaganda. In the case of white propaganda, we know who is the messenger and where does the message come from. So the white art world, you could say, it's the one where we are here. It's relatively public. We know where the money comes from. There's a couple of contemporary artists. They circulate nationally, a couple of them internationally through biennials, whatnot. It's relatively clear where the funding comes from and who produces the message that you're receiving. These are relatively traceable. But then there's also the dark art world. And the dark art world is, for example, the Pentagon Liaison Office that funds and directs popular Hollywood blockbusters that we've all seen, but we don't know that they are advising and financing and why. It's the game designers of Call of Duty that were hired by the Pentagon to advise them on future conflict scenarios. It's the Red Team, which is a team of science fiction writers hired by the French Ministry of Defense to advise the French Ministry of Defense on future conflicts that the military-industrial complex cannot yet imagine might happen. It's Steve Bannon, the ideologue of Trump, who's also a filmmaker and who made 10 years of films. For 10 years he made films that imagined Trumpism even before Trump came into being. It's Vladislav Surkov, the theater maker and dramaturg that developed the concept of sovereign democracy, that is essentially Putinism. They're artists, game designers, science fiction writers, filmmakers, dramaturgs. Most of us might not know their names, and we might not even know that they exist, but we are living in their world. That's the dark art world. It's the equivalent of black propaganda, but from the contemporary art point of view. What the aim is of the propaganda school is to study this black propaganda, this dark art world. How did we come to live in their realities? How do we analyze propaganda? How do we recognize propaganda? How do we develop propaganda literacy? And on the other hand, how do we develop strategies of counter-propaganda? How do we propagate differently? And how do we build also on the history that propaganda has played for emancipatory political movements? Whether it's W.E.B. Du Bois' concept of black propaganda that he developed in the context of the civil rights movement and black liberation movement in the US, whether it's Lucy Lippard that talks about the importance of intimate feminist propaganda, in an alternative propaganda to the dominant patriarchal propaganda, or even Donna Haraway, who spoke of the importance of propaganda to build new interspecies relationships, an alternative form of ecological propaganda. We cannot leave the question of propaganda only to our enemies. There must also be a way of propagating alternative emancipatory realities. So, How long did I talk? 19 minutes. Wow, amazing. I had 20 minutes and I'm exactly on time. It's a miracle. So thank you so much for for bearing with me and being so patient to listen to me. Now we're going to listen to the real faculty of the propaganda school, to Andrea first and then to Jan, but they will be introduced formally by Karine.